A lot of our focus, of course, has been on the partial preterist view, right? That a lot of these things have to do with things at the end time. So what are the other views of these letters? Well, in general, most idealists and futurists would accept a similar position. Right? So even though futurists believe a lot of revelation is still to come, they would say that those 7 churches were 7 literal churches that were written to by Jesus through John. And so most people most interpreters of Revelation would agree that these are 7 literal churches written to in the first century. There are some futurists, and even though there aren't too many historicists around anymore, traditionally historicists have tended to look at it a little bit differently. That instead of it being to 7 literal churches in the first century, they have spiritualized these churches and tended to look at them as representative of ages and themes. That essentially that the letters of the churches, the letters to the churches in chapter 2 and chapter 3 are 7 different time periods or attitudes or positions the church will find itself in. So a majority of people would agree with it's 7 literal churches, but a few would say, right, these are spiritualized, they're not related to literal churches. But there's nothing in the text of the letters or Revelation for us that would encourage us to interpret it this way. Everything seems to be indicative of a message directed to 7 literal churches. Because, you know, there's in every time period, there are churches that could fit the mold of any of these churches, right? In our time, if we looked around long enough, we could find churches that look like Ephesus, that look like Smyrna, that look like Laodicea. Right? So there's never been a time period in history where all the churches in the world have looked like Laodicea, Ephesus, and then all of the churches looking like Smyrna. There's always this kind of mixture of, as Jesus says in Matthew 13, weeds. There's some good things, there's some negative things. And so this spiritualized version doesn't seem to hold up very well to not only the text, but also our own experience of church history and our own experience of society now. As we finish with chapter 3 and move into chapter 4, we begin to see there is kind of this abrupt change. Because chapter 2, chapter 3 has been these letters directed to these 7 churches, but all of a sudden we're moving on to something completely different. So let's turn to chapter 4 now, and if somebody would read verses 1 through 5, somebody else read 6 through 11. So chapter 4, 1 through 5, and 6 through 11.
After these things I looked, and behold, a door standing open in heaven. And the first voice which I heard was like a trumpet speaking with me, saying, Come up here, and I will show you things which must take place after this. Immediately I was in the Spirit, and behold, a throne sat in heaven, and one sat on the throne. And he who sat there was like a jasper and a sardius stone in appearance. And there was a rainbow around the throne, and appearance like wind. Around the throne were 24 thrones, and on the thrones I saw 24 elders sitting, clothed in white robes, and they had crowns of gold on their heads. And from the throne proceeded lightnings, thunderings, and voices. 7 lamps of fire were burning before the throne, which are the 7 spirits of God.
And before the throne there was, as it were, a sea of glass, like crystal. And around the throne, on each side of the throne, are 4 living creatures, full of eyes in front and behind. The first living creature like a lion, the second living creature like an ox, the third living creature with the face of a man, and the fourth living creature like an eagle in flight. And And the four living creatures, each of them with six wings, are full of eyes all around and within, and day and night they never cease to say, Holy, holy, holy is the Lord God Almighty, who was and is to come. And whenever the living creatures give glory and honor and thanks to Him who is seated on the throne, who lives forever and ever. The 24 elders fall down before Him who is seated on the throne and worship Him who lives forever and ever. They cast their crowns before the throne, saying, Worthy are you, our Lord and God, to receive glory and honor and power, for you created all things, and by your will they existed and were created.
All right, so obviously quite a bit of difference compared to what we've just been going through. Right? And so now we're getting to the part of Revelation where people go, I just don't understand it. Right? And it's kind of, when you see some of these descriptions, and if you try to picture in your mind some of these things, they can be kind of freaky and disturbing. Right? I mean, these beings with like an ox head, and then he's got wings, and his wings have eyes on them, and that can be kind of creepy. And so it's no wonder people, are hesitant to explore Revelation, especially once you get through. Maybe those first three chapters were good, but once you get to chapter 4, then it gets very confusing. But hopefully some of the things we'll talk about will help explain some of those things, help us better understand what's going on here. But the other thing to keep in mind here is that I don't think we want to miss that there are some close connections between what has just gone before in chapters 2 and 3 and chapter 4. If you had to describe what Jesus is doing in chapters 2 and 3, what would you say? What would you say Jesus is doing? In writing these letters to the 7 churches, what is He doing?
Telling them where they stand.
All right, He's telling them where they stand. What else?
Letting them know it is to come.
Yeah, He's letting them know that there's some things coming, and so are you going to be prepared for those things? Well, in a sense, chapter 4 is the start of what's coming, right? And so He's been preparing them, warning them, and then now John's going to explain what's coming. And so, there's a connection there. Another thing that's being done here is, we saw this picture of this heavenly Christ, eyes of fire, white hair like wool, all those kind of things. But chapters 4 and 5 are kind of establishing that authority, especially when we get into chapter 5. All right, and so it's kind of it's kind of furthering this stage. We've seen some things on earth, now we're going to see some things in heaven. But in talking about in chapter 4, the center of focus being God on His throne, how would that fit with what's been talked about in chapters 2 and 3? So, what would be the function of telling people about this depiction of here's God on His throne? He's just wrote chapters 2 and 3. They've read through that, and now they get to this picture.
Can I say that as like reassurance? The fact that, hey, these are God is actually who He said He is, and Jesus is actually who He said He is, and this is evidence of that. This is the throne room at this time.
Yeah, and furthermore, by depicting Him as on His throne, what would that suggest? Right, king, which would, right? Essentially, that idea of, here's God in control, He's on His throne, He has authority, He sits above all other powers on earth. And so God is in control, He's aware of what's going on earth. Furthermore, it reminds the churches of Asia of God's characteristics. Right? And we'll talk about some of those because they're pictured in images, but I think we can see some very important characteristics of what God's like. Chapters 4 and 5 also serve to continue this message of overcoming, conquering, which will continue to be spread throughout the rest of Revelation. But in thinking about what it might offer Christians, especially Christians in the 21st century, certainly it can offer us a lot of these kind of things, but perhaps it could also offer us an example for our worship. Not that we need to establish living creatures or statues of living creatures in our church auditoriums or anything like that, but thinking of the majesty of God, and when they're in the presence of God, their response, and what God is worthy, and all these kind of things, should be things that as Christians we hold in our minds and in our hearts that pour forth in worship. Right? And so while it might not take the form that it takes in Revelation 4, it's coming from the same kind of things. It's coming from the same kind of truths. It's coming from the same kind of attitudes. It's also, I think, telling that we should recognize connections between Revelation chapters 4 and 5 and Daniel chapter 7. And a lot of this is coming from a commentary written by G.K. Beale. He really stresses the importance of this, and we'll look at other passages as well. We've already looked at Daniel chapter 7 when we talked about the Son of Man being, in Revelation 1, being a combination of the Ancient of Days from Daniel chapter 7 and the Son of Man figure in Daniel chapter 7. But these are some things that Beale points out about some connections between these two passages. In both passages, we see God seated on his throne. And in both cases, of course, I think that notion of God in control, God as the authority, supreme king, are emphasized there. In both passages, it is emphasized that there is fire before the throne. In Revelation, it's specifically 7 torches, but this idea of fire blazing in God's presence. In both Revelation 4 and 5 and Daniel, God is surrounded by heavenly servants. Right? There are heavenly beings in attendance on God. In both cases, there is some sort of written object that is opened, a book or scroll, depending on the translation. And so this kind of revelation, revealing of a mystery, both in Daniel and in Revelation. In both of these passages as well, there is a messianic figure who is given authority or has authority. Now, certainly, I think in both cases it's Jesus that's referred to, but this Son of Man, appointed, anointed figure. In both cases, the Messiah is a ruler over a kingdom, but a ruler over a kingdom forever. Right? The dominion, the power, the kingship that this messianic figure has is for all times. In both Revelation and Daniel, it is stressed that this kingdom is composed of people from all tribes, nations, and languages. That there isn't a specific group that is included or any groups excluded. And then finally, in both cases, the saints, God's Holy One, God's people, are given authority as well because of their presence in the kingdom, their participation in the kingdom. And so Daniel chapter 7 and Revelation chapters 4 and 5 have a lot of similarities. And Daniel, of course, very important text for Revelation. Serves to help with a variety of the symbols. But there are other passages we could include here as well. Ezekiel chapter 1, which we'll look at in a few minutes. Isaiah chapter 6, also has a lot of things that are present, reflected here as well. So a lot of Old Testament passages that are kind of showing up in Revelation. But it all starts with a door open in heaven. I don't know. I mean, what's going on here is very visual. Right? John is trying to describe in words what he sees. I'm wondering, when he notices this door in heaven, what was it like? Right? Does he suddenly see a door like you would see to the, for the classroom? Right? It's got a doorknob and it's open. Is it kind of like, you see the sky and then all of a sudden it opens and there's this kind of entranceway into the sky, right? Kind of slides open like Star Trek or something like that. Right, well, what's it like? Well, not told, but suddenly there is a door open in heaven. And as we've talked, Revelation is very symbolic. So, a door in heaven. What does this mean? A door stood open in heaven. What is this reflective of?
Perhaps our opportunity to get there.
All right, so there's the opportunity to enter into heaven. John's being given access, right? And especially, of course, in the idea of it's being open, so something secret or something hidden is about to be revealed. So John is given access, and he's told, right, to come up here. Right? Encouraged to ascend into heaven for what he will experience. And there he will be shown some things. But it's interesting in how Jesus, or the voice, which is probably Jesus, words it. John is going to be shown the things that must take place. It's not the things that might take place. It's not the things that perhaps could take place. It's the things that must take place. God has made a determination. It will take place. And so John sees a door open in heaven. He hears the voice saying, "Come up here," with also the instructions of what he's to experience. And then he says, "I was in the Spirit," at once. Now, he had used a similar phrase in chapter 1. I was in the Spirit on the Lord's Day. Essentially, what I think John's communicating here is that whatever happens here, he is not going in bodily form into heaven. Right? He is spiritually going into heaven. There's some sort of, we might almost call it an ecstatic experience. Right? Maybe even an out-of-body experience. Right? The exact mechanism isn't described here, but it seems by saying, in the Spirit I went into heaven, he is not talking about being bodily taken into heaven. Of course, there might also be a comparison here to Ezekiel, who several times throughout the book of Ezekiel talks about the Spirit took me to Jerusalem. The Spirit took me to this valley filled with dry bones. Right? And so that might also be a reference here as well. And so John enters heaven.